Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, it's going to be the first in a series of episodes about dependent personality and personality disorders. If you're familiar with this format, it's going to go pretty similarly. The first one in the series is always going to be on key features. That's today. And essentially, I'm going to have my handy-dandy diagnostic manual down here that I will reference and elaborate upon the key and critical symptoms, but also integrate psychodynamic theory about the personality in the process. And then subsequent episodes are going to be on a few things. It could be subtypes, gender, societal components, treatment, those sorts of things. And those are obviously to be determined, but that's what's going to be coming down the pike. But again, today is all about the key features. Now, as in all these episodes, I talk about the kind of duality, the wisdom and sort of the folly of our current diagnostic manual. The wisdom is they have distilled and done a heck of a lot of research over time to distill these into really the key and critical symptoms that tend to be present and that you only have to meet so many of them. For dependent personality, we've got 8 key symptoms, prototypical symptoms, and you need to meet 5 of those 8. Which of the 5? Well, it totally depends. The challenge, though, is they create what is, I think, very within the prototype. They create a somewhat restrictive box for what dependency can look like, and so hopefully along the way, I can elaborate and give a little bit more color shading depth and how this can present in different ways, particularly from a psychodynamic lens. So that is the goal for today: key features, and future episodes will tackle other aspects. So again, we've got 5 out of 8 for dependent personality disorder, and we'll go through these and chat about them. Number 1 has difficulty making everyday decisions without an excessive amount of advice and reassurance from others. Now, notice how I emphasize the word excessive, and this is really key and critical. It's also very subjective because it is not unusual in human development, particularly when we are at younger ages, that we need reassurance from other people. We are relational creatures, and what keeps us on the straight and narrow, typically speaking, is we get a general consensus from the world around us for what is wise or economical. One of the challenges when we probably go into this in the development of the condition episode is very frequently when they were younger, and this depends on genetics and socialization, all that other sort of stuff, is they often don't get enough guidance from people around them. They're left to kind of fill in the blanks. And with that, there is this sort of like, okay, I don't know if I'm going to do it right or wrong. And sure enough, the parent can be quite punitive and say, like, you didn't do that right. You didn't quite measure up, which reinforces like, oh no, I need feedback to make sure that I do this the right way. And so when they are reaching adulthood, they're seeking this excessive, like, are you sure? Is this the right thing? Is this how you want it? Are you, just double, triple, quadruple checking before they're like, okay, I can go forward with this. Now, some of that you'll notice is about caretaking other people. In other circumstances, it's less about caretaking other people and more about like, I am inadequate. I cannot make the right decision for myself. And in these circumstances, it's like I have options in front of me, but I don't trust myself enough. I'm too ineffectual to make an effective decision for myself, so I need your input. So it's less about caretaking and more about like I need to be caretaken. Is that the right conjugation for that word? And this is where it can put a lot of strain on relationships because they're constantly like, I don't know if I can. Is that the right thing? Should I? Please help me. Tell me what to do at the end of the day. And they will need an excessive amount of reassurance, whether it's I'm doing it right by you, right? Or am I making the right decision? Excessive. Number 2 needs others to assume responsibility for most major areas of his or her life. So, let me double check. Assume responsibility for most major areas. Yeah. So this kind of links with what I was talking about with number 1 is like, I don't know, I'm pretty ineffectual. And so if you hand like a big ticket responsibility my way, I get real nervous and real anxious because I'm ineffectual. Other people are better at this and I don't want to screw this up. And so if there's a major area of concern, they will often solicit support and be like, I need you to take care of this. And they'll offload it and basically put themselves into a situation where they're dependent upon the person to manage these major areas. Finances is a very common one. Basically, I don't know if I can manage this effectively. I need you to take care of it. Now, there's tons of relationships that do this, right? Like we kind of divide and conquer in pretty healthy relationships and say like, okay, you manage this, I manage this. But that there's a nature of trust behind that. I trust that you will, manage this sort of thing. Not like, I can't do it, I don't know, I'm not sure, please manage this for me. So again, devil's in the details, and it's most or multiple areas, major areas in life, not just one. And we all got our things. So we're just like, that's not my forte. Can you help me out with that? Number 3 has difficulty expressing disagreement with others because of fear of loss of support or approval. And it does have a bold note. Do not include realistic fears of retribution. This is sensible because, their unhealthy relationship dynamics is not uncommon for people with dependent personalities to find their way, very unfortunately, into unhealthy relationships, both because they attract people who tend to take up more space because they're so passive and so forgiving and just like want people to exhibit power over them. And people who love power aren't always well psychologically organized. But sometimes too, they will contribute to unhealthy relationships because they're so passive, and they push the other individual to take then a more assertive role, which then I'm getting ahead of myself, which sometimes then they can get resentful about, ignoring their own role to play. So indeed, it could be an absolutely toxic, bad relationship. And if they're like, if I don't do this the right way, I'm going to get hit or something like that, that has nothing to do with dependency. That's called a straight up abusive relationship. And we understand abusive relationships. If you get people out of that, they're not going to naturally have a dependent personality. Might those two be correlated, that dependent personalities find their way into relationships that could result in abuse? That is possible. But it's not a full it's not a causal thing. It's just, it's just a circumstance. It's a kind of contextual variable. You can get people out of those circumstances, and dependency, anything that could look like dependency, evaporates because they get out of that healthy relationship and they become more of themselves. And so it's a really important note. Like, if there's legitimate retribution and something bad's going to happen to them, that has nothing to do with dependency. That's called like basic 101 survival, right? So what is this number 3 actually talking about? Well, these, when you talk to them, they are usually checking a lot of like, I didn't hurt your feelings, did I? Is that okay? And there's definitely sensitive people in this world that do this. I do this a lot to my detriment, and usually creates a lot of anger if I'm not tending to it, because I feel like I'm constantly giving and being like, is that okay? Did I hurt your feelings? I'm not sure. Because they're afraid that there's going to be some sort of rejection or loss, that if they are not operating really well and perfectly in the relationship and not appeasing and giving all the needs to their partner or to their family, they're terrified that they're going to be abandoned in some way. And some of this does have ties to legitimate attachment issues early on, like straight up. Let me rephrase that. Like straight up, it happened to them, like actual experiences of abandonment and rejection. And other times it's more kind of diffuse attachment issues, and it's just fear. Like, you go to the past, they were never technically abandoned, but there was always this insecurity around their relationships. And so they're highly insecure, like, oh gosh, if I misstep, somebody's going to reject me, somebody's going to leave me, I'm not going to get the support I need anymore. What's really fascinating, and I'm not sure if I'm going to talk about this in one of the later items, what I sometimes find is this is one of those items, one of the symptoms that has the layperson confusing a dependent personality for a narcissistic personality. Because you might have noticed, as I was describing that, it's about them. It can sound very selfish in a way, because it's like, am I okay? Am I doing this right? Are you sure? Is everything going to be okay? And what that draws from the person, the person opposite to them, is this constant need to reassure and caretake, which can feel very self-involved the more it happens. Usually what we call our initial countertransference reaction is one of sympathy and support. But over time, it can get very frustrating, because it's just like, can you just not require me to support you all the time? It's all about you. And so to naive, ignorant lay people, that's like, well, they're narcissistic because it's always about them. Well, no, narcissism, like, I don't give a shit what you think or feel, excuse my French. I'm going to do me, whereas dependency is, I'm so terrified. I need this to be focused on whether or not I'm okay, whether or not we are okay. That's not narcissism, that's dependency. So hopefully that makes sense. Number 4, has difficulty initiating projects or doing things on his or her own because of a lack of self-confidence and judgment or abilities rather than a lack of motivation or energy. That last part is in parentheses. Now, this is another really important qualifying factor because people who are incredibly depressed or have ADHD or whatever, they can absolutely have difficulties with motivation and energy. And so, it's not just like, come on, you need to get up and do something. And it's just like, no, I don't know if I can. That's not dependency. That's just, again, avolition, anhedonia, distractibility, demotivation because it's not something they're passionate about, whatever. That's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about is, it's interesting they don't qualify this, is it usually has links back to that self-esteem, self-worth, that they're too ineffectual. They believe themselves to be too ineffectual. And so they don't want to initiate projects because they can't do it on their own. They're incapable. They need somebody else's support. It's like, well, I could, but I'm probably going to do it wrong. And I'd be really nervous if it doesn't go well. Then I tend to just drop it because, then I don't want to fail. And so I could really use your support. Could you at least check in on me, make sure I'm doing everything right? Actually, this part I'm not very good at. Could you take this part over? I can always do this next part. And it's not like a sneaky, like, haha, I'm duping you to do my work. Like they're seriously straight up terrified of taking this responsibility on their own. And they think they will fail. They think they will mess up legitimately. And so they believe other people are more powerful than them, or more capable than them. Even when there's no evidence, they will have this kind of pathological belief that others are powerful and I'm weak and ineffectual. And so they're not going to just like self-start on a task because they really need the reassurance of someone being around them to, best case scenario, safeguard against their failure, worst case scenario, because they literally feel like they can't do it on their own. If you hear the sirens, perfect timing. I can't do it on my own. I hope everybody's okay. So that's number 4. Just to recap, so number 1, difficulty making everyday decisions without reassurance. Number 2, I need others to assume responsibility for most major areas of the life. Number 3, difficulty expressing disagreement due to fears of abandonment or rejection. Number 4, difficulty initiating without support, essentially. Number 5, go to excessive lengths to abstain. It's a Freudian slip that would be useful. But anyway, goes to excessive lengths to obtain nurturance and support from others to the point of volunteering to do things that are unpleasant. Now, once again, it's very normal that we want people's approval. We do. We're relational creatures. If you don't give a crap about what anybody thinks, you got an opposite problem. I mean, healthy people with secure attachments find this sort of in-between where they care, but they can also delineate and be like, I'm not going to care about that one, right? Like that one just doesn't feel legitimate, or I don't need like 10 people giving me a high five. I can just, feed off the one person who's like, you know what, you're doing a great job. I'm like, okay, I can live with that. But with this one, it's it's never enough. It's like an insatiable lust for nurturance and support. And once again, it's not like a leech. It's not like a parasitic version of narcissism. It's more in the sense of like, I'm so weak and so frail. I am so incapable. I need someone. I need someone to nurture and support me and make sure that I feel okay, that I feel sufficiently safe, that, everything's okay as long as this powerful other being is with me. And think of it kind of like a pilot fish. And pilot fish are the ones that kind of attach themselves to like sharks and whales. And, they are their own operating individual human being, but safety is secured by being attached to this larger creature. Safety, nourishment, all those sorts of things, because it's, obviously the animals aren't thinking this, but it's like, I'm not big enough. I'm not strong enough to exist in this world independent of a powerful other. And so I need that nurturance. I need that support. And the to the point of doing something unpleasant is super duper important because they're so giving. For this job, I need to move across the country. Are you okay with that? And they're like, yeah, of course. Anything we need, I totally get it. But in the inside, they're like, no, not okay. Not okay. Oh my God, I don't want to do that. That's the worst thing. My family's over here. I'm scared of that, blah, blah, blah. But the fear of losing that support and that nurturance is so great, they will go along with it. And this is what I was talking about earlier, what gets them into pickles, where, we got to be careful, not like blaming the victim, but they will very quickly, I shouldn't say they will very quickly find themselves in unhealthy relationships because they just, I don't know if permissive is the right word, but they don't have any rules or boundaries. Whatever needs to be done. As long as I've got support nurturance. This where it gets really tough. Like we talk about permission around like sex and sexuality with these individuals can be really challenging because they are like, well, I don't want to be rejected, so I'll do that thing. I don't want someone to be unhappy with me, so I'll do that thing. And obviously it's not just sex, but literally anything. Oh yeah, I'll take that on. Don't worry about that. But I don't think they go into this. Yeah, no, they don't. What's really interesting from a psychodynamic perspective is very frequently this is where passive aggressive behavior begins to form with individuals with dependent personalities, is because at the end of the day, while the pathology is so strong that they will give and give and give and convince themselves it's the right thing to do, there's another part of self, another self state that usually exists. It's very small. It's not very powerful. But it says like, I give so much and I don't get much in return. And that can breed a lot of anger and resentment that they don't know how to express because they're too afraid to express it. If they express their anger and resentment, they'll be rejected and the relationship will fall apart. They'll lose all their support and then they're afraid and alone. But it lurks beneath the surface because they just keep doing this and they will feel taken advantage of, and they'll have like passive aggressive behaviors as a means of diffusing that kind of frustration. And then they quickly reel that back in and go, oh, no, everything's fine. It's like, no, it wasn't. No, it wasn't fine. There's some legitimate hurt in there. There's some legitimate pain. So, yeah. Number 6, feel uncomfortable or helpless when alone because of exaggerated fears of being unable to care for himself or herself. I've already alluded to this. I mean, so much of this is about like, I am weak, I am frail, I can't do this by myself, and in an exaggerated way. So what this usually becomes most apparent when they're between relationships, or their kind of attachment, the people that they're dependent on aren't as present, and they become very frantic because it's like, hold on, I'm not okay because my source of support and reassurance is suddenly gone. Or if a relationship truly ends, they derail themselves, and you're like, whoa. Like they just absolutely an emotional wreck because their center, you think of it like their center of self, their self exists in other people. Like their sense of themselves and safety is transient. It is barely kind of present in oneself unless it is attached to a more powerful other. And so once that other powerful other is too far away, what are they left with? Right? They're not holding much anymore. They have this like barely a tether to the world because they're just so lost in their identity of like, I have any power, any authority, any capability. I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm not going to be able to survive. And so they have a really hard time when alone, real or perceived. Again, they can have this reaction just by virtue of someone going on vacation for a little bit of time. Or if you're the provider, you go on vacation for 3 weeks, and all of a sudden unstable. Number 7, urgently seeks another relationship as a source of care or support when a close relationship ends. So this is kind of catty corner. I've said this in other episodes. One of the challenges when you're going through these diagnostic criteria, or maybe one of the benefits of going through these diagnostic criteria, you'll notice they always like quickly cascade into one another. Like if one of them is truly present, deeply present, it will often be attached to another one just automatically. I mean, still, if you're a provider, you need to be diligent and really roll through here that you're not like reacting based on one of these variables and all the other 7 aren't true. But more than often, you're going to see, you see one and you see more, because we just talked about like uncomfortable or helpless when alone. Well, one of the challenges, they are not good at distress tolerance more often than not, because again, I'm weak and ineffectual, and so I cannot manage myself alone, and they will derail themselves for a little bit of time, but eventually, if left to their own devices, although it won't take very long, I'm not talking eventually 6 months, a year from now, they will find their way quickly into another source of reassurance, another relationship in some sort of way, because they can't make it on there. They can't. And so the defense demands that they find a new attachment. And this is one of the greatest dangers when they transition relationships. They will find their way back into another unhealthy relationship and spend a lot of time convincing you that it's going to be a good relationship. And they're overlooking major issues because they're defending the defense. I'm not effectual. I cannot exist on my own. And so I have to be okay through this relationship. And so this new relationship is going to be the best one. It's the healthy one. And that's a matter of protecting themselves. Like, I can't go through that again. I need somebody to attach to. I don't care if I just went from a blue whale to a freaking great white shark. Go back to the pilot fish analogy or metaphors. It's like, I don't care. I just need to attach myself because I can't feed. I'm not going to be safe unless I do. So I don't care who comes swimming by. If it's big and it's powerful, I'm going for it. Well, what happens if that's an unhealthy relationship? So I will say, interesting aside, I think is sometimes you'll hear them when they talk about being in treatment. What's really interesting is when they will kind of crap talk their prior providers, but they stuck with them for a long time. and I think it follows a similar pattern, is like they can be lifelong therapy clients. And I'll get into the treatment, because the treatment, I think, is really interesting with dependent personality. I think a lot of people would do something potentially counterproductive, but I digress. They will stay in these relationships forever because that's their support. And now, I'm not saying the provider is inherently bad. Heaven forbid, if you'd actually talk about the conflict of what wasn't working, maybe the therapeutic relationship in progress would have become better. But it would not be my first rodeo that I meet with someone who has a dependent personality and they're like, yeah, they weren't terribly helpful. But then you're sitting there going like, well, why were you with them for 5 years? Because they were afraid. They were afraid. Like, this is what's familiar. This is what's powerful. It helped me. At the end of the day, I didn't like it, but it helped me feel secure and safe. Safety and security at all costs. Doesn't matter how bad all the other specifics are. If that fundamental base need is met through that relationship, the relationship will be sustained at all costs, unless the defense is challenged. Or it gets caustic and corrosive enough, they will eventually put their foot down, but their line in the sand for when they do that is, it's way out there. Well beyond what most other people would tolerate that don't have a dependent framework. So, and last but not least, number 8 is unrealistically preoccupied with fears of being left to take care of him or herself. Sounds somewhat redundant, doesn't it? Well, again, this one's a little bit of a clarification, because if they're in a relationship and they're afraid of doing things on their own, they offload, responsibility, they're very passive, all this sort of stuff. Well, it's not like their personality issues are not at all apparent. They will still have irrational fears of like, yeah, but what if something kind of goes wrong? I'm not sure if I'm going to be safe. What happens if they leave? What happens if they die? It's kind of like people who have really severe separation anxiety when they're younger will sometimes go on to develop kind of dependent like frameworks, because it's a similar sort of thing, like more anxious, preoccupied, like, I don't know, I can't do this, and I need that other person, and what happens if something happens to that other person? I don't know if I can do it. Long and the short of it is this one's basically just saying, like, just because they're in a relationship that's satiating all these needs, even if unhealthily, it doesn't mean the fears are gone. They will readily be anxious and can be readily anxious and preoccupied of like, yeah, but what happens if it ends? It's like, well, it's not. Are you getting any indication that it is? No, I'm just afraid that what if? So yeah, just to recap, number 1, They need excessive reassurance to make decisions. Number two, they really don't take responsibility. They're very passive individuals in their own lives, their own responsibilities. They have really hard time, number three, expressing disagreements or any sort of relational conflict because of fears of abandonment. Number four, they really don't initiate things on their own, again, because they're ineffectual and they're afraid of the outcomes. Number five, excessive lengths to obtain nurturance and support, even at the detriment of their own needs and values and wishes. Number six, uncomfortable in being alone, very uncomfortable. It leads very quickly in number seven, urgently seeking new relationships to satiate that need, to fill that void, to fill that hole. And number eight, even when they're in those relationships, they're terrified it's going to end, and the what ifs feed ongoing anxiety. So those are the key features as listed by the good old DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, 5TR, whenever the 6 comes out. Trying to think if there's anything to add on the psychodynamic end. I think most of it treads into future episodes around developments and subtype kind of stuff. But I think, to me, like, if I had to distill really key features, is at the end of the day, there's a self-esteem issue for dependent personality. These individuals, again, see themselves as very ineffectual and incapable. And that is at the core. I think it's very hard to see a dependent personality that does not have that underlying self-concept issue. So that's a great place to start. But that seeing oneself as ineffectual is not uncommon. There's other internalizing type personalities that share that somewhat of a similar self-concept issue. What that is then added to, what is added to that is this, sort of passivity of like, I can't do things myself, and so I'm dependent upon powerful others to do those things for me or to reassure me so that I can do things well. And that's kind of cascades into number three of like, they solicit nurturance and support through their frailty. That they're like, I am weak and ineffectual, and that is how I obtain nurturance. This is the only way they know how to obtain nurturance. They're terrified of being present, more present in the relationship, because they don't know who they are. They don't have values per se. They do, but they're not most salient. It exists in other people. Their identity exists through other people. They're sort of like notions of codependency, although that's like two people colluding with this. It's like, I need this person to define who I am and define my capability and my safety. I cannot secure that on my own. I cannot. And so that lack of sense of self, the frailty to obtain nurturance, and the passivity and unwillingness to fully inhabit a relationship, I think are a pretty easy trifecta if you personally are possibly going through something like that, or you're noticing this in perhaps a patient that you see. I think if you get that kind of trifecta going on, it's a good red flag to be like, hey, maybe you might want to look at the dependency, kind of a dependent personality, and see what that looks like. I think that's it. I mean, I will say the trickiest thing, the future episodes we'll talk about gender, and there's like gender dynamics to this and gender socialization to this. But just, I think it's so tough because we are relational creatures. We are dependent upon other people in our lives. We are. And so I think, you just kind of have to, we all have different lines in the sand for what is like an appropriate amount of dependency. And there's cultural variables to this. There's gender variables to this. I mean, there is subjectivity because dependency is, I talked about this in the narcissism episode. We all have the narcissistic defense. Well, we all have dependency needs. We all do. And I think that's the hardest part. It's like, what constitutes too much? What constitutes this pathological, sufficiently severe, persistent, and rigid method and sort of ideology around in their relationships, how they relate to other people, and by proxy, how they relate to, i.e. they don't relate to themselves because they're so dependent on other people. So, I guess I say that if you're kind of a lay person and you're concerned, like maybe I have a dependent personality, be curious. I think it's always good to be curious about our interpersonal boundaries. But just because you depend and you seek reassurance periodically, or we feel safer and more secure when people see us and understand us and can validate our position, that does not mean dependent personality disorder is there. I think I used in another episode, it's more like a ratio thing. Like if you're doing more than 50% of the time, or you find yourself chronically passive and terrified of expressing yourself because of a fear of ramifications, it's something that you might want to look into and be a little bit curious about, because maybe you're leaning that way. Remembering that, the current diagnostic manual says you're disordered or you're not. When in reality, psychodynamic theory says like, well, it happens on kind of a scale. There's some variance in that. I have disclosed in the various episodes, like, I have what I would argue a depressive personality, which I've not made an episode on that yet. It's not in the DSM anymore, the Diagnostic Manual anymore. But do I have flares of dependency in there? Oh, you better believe it. It's not what I lead with, but I am scared of misstepping with people and getting rejected because of it, because I'm not effective enough, or I'll be avoidant around certain tasks because I'd rather somebody else do it because they're probably going to do it right and I'm going to do it wrong anyway. It's not what I lead with, but it is a part of me. But because it's not what I lead with, it's not the dominant thing. I ascribe it more to like a depressive problem than it is a true blue dependency problem. Does that disclosure help you? I don't know. I'm just trying to offer that there's more gray in this condition. And we'll get into kind of other nuances in future episodes of gender, et cetera, et cetera. So as ever, I hope this is helpful and informative going through these key elements. Look out for future episodes on other aspects about dependent personality disorder. But otherwise, I thank you for listening or watching. And as always, stay curious.